Recording in progress. Recording in
Wesley, do you want to take care while we're talking here for a little bit, omitting people and muting them and doing all that?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Patrick.
Thank you. Well, it's 6 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and start. I want to thank you all for being on tonight. Second night of our online regional hay school. And again, my name is Patrick Davis, regional livestock field specialist. In my office is in Stockton, Missouri, which is in Southwest Missouri. And tonight we're going to have some presentations by Tim Schnakenberg. He's a regional agronomy field specialist in Stone County, and which is around Galena, which is very southern Missouri. And his first talk, he's going to talk about hay and baleage harvest systems. And then after that talk, we're actually going to have, we'll take a short break, and then I will do a talk on hay feeding management. And then Tim will finish up the evening talking about hay storage management. And so basically, we are recording tonight. And so the presentation will be, and I will, I don't know if I'll get that done tomorrow, but I'll definitely get that done by Monday. But we'll get the recording put together and get that sent out to the people who have registered for the meeting. Also, prior to tonight, I sent out our handouts of the presentations for tonight. And if you didn't get those, let me know and send me an email, and we'll get that taken care of. Also, I'm trying to think what else. If you weren't on the other night, basically, best way to handle questions through the night is there's a chat button down there. It's either at the bottom of the screen or top of the screen, or and click on that and put the questions in there. And throughout the evening, we'll get those answered. That's probably the best way to do it. We'll also take questions at the end of each presentation, and knowing the speakers, Tim and myself, we'll ask for questions periodically throughout the talks. And so if you have any questions or anything, just let us know. So I think that's about all I've got to say for now. Again, just want to thank you all for being on. And Tim, I think we'll let you have the floor. talk about hay and baleage harvest systems.
Okay, Patrick, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Good, good. I just want to welcome everyone for being here tonight. I think it's a good topic for April as we go into hay season. That starts, well, it kind of depends on what you're growing, but talked to a producer this afternoon. He'll be harvesting his rye probably in less than a couple of weeks, maybe 10 days from now. And so his hay season's already going to get started pretty quick. And then others, it'll be first part of May, maybe middle of May. Hopefully you don't start in the middle of June. But that's why we're here tonight. We want to talk about some of the hay harvest systems that we've got and ways that we can put up stored forage, whether it's wet or dry. And I got to tell you on the outset that I don't think that it's really an easy task to tell somebody in a format, especially like this, or even in a classroom format, how to harvest hay properly. Sometimes it takes just learning it by doing. I can tell you, I've been around hay harvest since I was 14, I'd say. We were baling alfalfa hay, and I could tell you every single day is different. You're going to have different wind. You're going to have different sunlight penetration. You're going to have temperatures that are different. The ambient temperature, you're going to have the soil temperatures are going to be different. There's moisture differences. There's dew point. There's so many factors that come into play with making hay, and the different forages that we're growing. It's really difficult in our formats to train people how to do it properly. It's just difficult. So you almost have to kind of learn by doing. Hopefully you don't burn a barn down in the process. But that's one thing we want to focus on today is how to properly put it up in terms that we can all understand. So let's get going. I got to say, let's see here. Trying to advance just a second. Okay. Hay harvest has been around for generations, for hundreds of years. There's in temperate regions like we live, there are so many, much need to have some kind of forage that cattle can graze on or eat over the winter months. And as you can see, it's been very labor intensive. It's been a slow process over the years. You can see the lower left corner. That was one way that was done probably, 80, 100 years ago. You can see that, very labor intensive. You probably not only had three people out in the field, at least three, you probably had 2 or 3 down at the barn at the same time, putting it in the barn or stacking it somewhere. So it's been labor intensive. And one thing I can say about much of today's harvest is that we've seen some great technology that's come along. I'd say not the least of which has been the round baler that has been one of the greatest things that has improved the speed of harvest. And I'm not going to always say it's been efficient, but it has improved the amount of feed that we can put up with less people. And of course, if you're in the process, if you do square bales, I mean, we've got ways of gathering bales today where people don't have to handle it like they used to as much. We've got large square balers. We have wrappers. We have wrappers or balers and wrappers in the same tool. And now we have self-propelled round balers on the market. I was by a dealer just recently, and that one on the upper left side is on the lot right now. So it's whatever you need. There's usually a tool out there for you. I want to kind of start with talking about some of the hay and silage losses that can occur. There's 3 kinds of losses. Mechanical is a huge one when we're handling hay, whether it's running the baler or running the rake or the tedder. there's potential for some significant losses there. There's leaching losses that can occur if the weather turns bad on us. And of course, the natural losses that we have immediately after it's been cut is the respiration losses. But when you think about all the processes that come into play between mowing, maybe tedding, maybe raking, baling, or chopping and handling it, and then we're going to get into storage and then the feeding, there's a lot of potential for loss to occur. Think about how you have a cow out in a pasture who is reaching for a sward of grass, and they, they can have immediate intake of fresh forage. We're trying to mimic that with all this equipment as best we can, but we can't do it very well sometimes, but we do the best we can. But I'm just saying that there is potential for losses all the way through. And when it comes to just mowing and conditioning losses, these are data that have been used mainly for legume forage. It may not apply so much for grass losses, but let's just look at legume hay like alfalfa and red clover. And you can see that the type of mower that we have, whether it's a sickle bar, whether we've used a mower conditioner, or we've used a disc mower by itself or a disc mower, the potential for loss can start to add up little by little. You can see the chart showing dry matter loss and then the percent leaf loss. So it starts adding up a little bit. And then we start getting into raking, and the way we rake and when we rake can come into play as being a major issue for losses of leaves. And then tedding, definitely. Every time we put a piece of steel up against our forage, there's going to be some kind of loss. So think about that. The less steel you can rub up against it, the less loss you're going to have. So we try to minimize that. If you don't have to run a tedder, don't run a tedder, especially in legume forages. I personally don't even like to see a tedder in an alfalfa field, but there are times you have to do it in order to get it dry, to get it out before the weather rolls in. But if you can keep a tedder out of a red clover or an alfalfa field, you're going to be better off. But when you start getting, when your moisture level starts to really drop, that's when those leaves can drop off pretty fast. Baling losses aren't quite as bad, but they do happen. This is at 25% moisture with a preservative, and then you've got down to 12% moisture. There is some potential in that pickup and chamber to lose leaves. So add it all up. We sometimes use the term, and I think there's some truth to it, that maybe 50% of the hay that's harvested in the state of Missouri may never actually get to a cow. And when you start looking at these numbers, you realize, it does start to add up. We haven't even talked about storage and feeding yet, but yeah, it starts to add up. Let's talk also about the moisture content of the hay and how that impacts the quality of what we put up. You can see the picture of the square bale on the left, the discoloration that's going on there. Many of you may recognize that. Sometimes it happens when we're just kind of at a little on the upper end of the moisture level. And we didn't quite get it dry enough, but yet it wasn't bad enough to get a lot of mold. Some people call that tobacco hay. It will caramelize, if you will. And you do lose a little bit of quality, but sometimes seems like the cattle do prefer some of that caramelized hay. But you're really playing with fire when you are putting up hay like that, because sometimes it's not very far to where you can start getting mildew and mold. And speaking of mold, they say there's about 10 different genera of fungi that can be found in a windrow. And because of that, the molds are different. They vary a lot. The fungi will really start to develop if the conditions are right, especially between 20 and 30% moisture. So, you know, I know Bob Schulteis always referred to that as the garbage zone. 20 to 30% moisture. Um, and sometimes you get up into 30% moisture, you have potential for fungi to really explode. So that's why we kind of are careful about what we harvest this at. Cattle performance. It's mainly for beef cattle and even dairy cattle. It's going to be a refusal issue if there's a taste or dustiness or mold that's in there. They're just not, their intake is going to be down significantly. Horses probably are most susceptible. They can even have some respiratory issues with mold, but generally it's going to be refusal that's the main issue. It's pretty rare, if ever, for moldy hay to kill an animal. I'm not going to say it won't happen, but talking to Tim Evans on campus in the vet diagnostic lab, they don't see that very often. There was a study in Manitoba that showed that in dairy heifers, high fungal mass biomass levels led to a 40% decrease in their intake. No surprises there. They did a study at the University of Tennessee that I found, and they found that if you can kind of keep it to no more than 30% of the total ration, you might be able to get by. But you know, I think if the goal should be to completely keep it out as much as we can. So this one here, you'll see several times in our hay school. Generally, for a big round bale, we're shooting for about 18% moisture. That should be our goal. You can, if you're using large squares, you can be a little more, you probably need to drop it down a little more because they're just more, there's more bulk to it. There's more compaction in there. There's less opportunity for air movement around those bales. So 16% for those. And then we try not to get higher than 22% on square bales. I like to keep them a little lower than that, but 22%, you know, since you can adjust the how they're stacked sometimes, that can be done. How do you test for forage moisture? You've got, here's three options. You've got the more expensive of $446 here for this particular one. You've got a Coster unit, which is about $374 in this example. And then you've got a microwave and a gram scale, maybe $75. I'm going to tell you this right up front. The cheaper one, the cheaper option here generally is the most accurate. That's the preferred way. I actually have all three of these. And the preferred way of testing in my mind is a microwave and a gram scale, where you measure out a set amount, put it in there, chop it up, put it in there, weigh it before, weigh it after, about maybe 3-4 minutes, and then see what the percent difference in moisture is. A lot of people think that's too much trouble. There are some other units that are out there that are mounted in the cab of the tractor, and those may be pretty handy as well. The Coster unit is a little challenging. It takes a little time to heat it up that way. But I'll tell you the most expensive one there, I also have that one as well, a Delmhorst, and I don't know that it's the most accurate. We generally have so much variability in the hay, and just sticking a probe in one place, it may be very different from where we put it in the next place. And so I think the cheaper two here probably are more accurate. Let's talk about rained on hay. That's a fact of life, unfortunately. Its effect on forage quality. Usually the protein loss is going to be a direct result of leaf loss. And that's going to happen a lot of times in dried legume hay that's been out there a while. So they've also found that as the soluble carbohydrates leach in a rainfall event, the structural fibers start to make up this, forage dry matter, higher percent of the forage dry matter. And so, a rained on hay can decline 6 to 40% in digestibility. So these things are facts of life, things that we want to avoid, but sometimes we can't always do it. There's been some research, quite a bit of research on alfalfa at the University of Wisconsin that I've studied. You can remove as much as 40% of the nutrients in a single rain event at times. The marketability drops if you're in the hay business, especially if you're in a square bale hay business. Nobody wants to buy a rained on bale of hay, square bale of hay. The minimizing that dry time is the key. And so that's what we're after. How can you maintain forage quality? Well, in Wisconsin, they've done some studies. They found that the maximum loss in dry matter occurred with a 2.5 inches of rain on hay that was nearly dry. I mean, I've actually cut hay, alfalfa hay, in the rain before, not worrying about it because I knew that I had looked at the weather and the rain was moving out in an hour or two, and I was going to be moving on, and it's going to start drying. I'm not too worried about rain right there at the day of cutting so much, but rain 2 days later, that's a totally different situation. And then we run into problems with rainfall is a single event. If it's a short event, rainfall intensity is higher versus a longer, lower intensity event. We sometimes have problems when it's wetted many times. You just keep getting this cycle of rain over and over on it. That's when it's really discouraging to me, when you can't even get it out of the field and it's been a week. I will say, though, we sometimes don't take enough risks, in my view, on hay. We have to understand that we will get hay rained on sometimes. I know our goal is not to, but here's a study that was done at the University of Arkansas, and they found on Bermuda grass hay that a 3-inch rain on dry Bermuda grass, it dropped the TDN, total digestible nutrients, about 1.5%, which, wasn't too bad, especially if you compare that to a 2-week delay in harvest. It dropped 6.5%, and a 4-week delay in harvest, waiting on the weather to clear, that was a 15% drop in TDN. So sometimes we don't take the chances we probably should. Getting hay wet, unless you're probably in the dairy business or in the racehorse business, you probably should take some risk. Go ahead and get some hay cut if you can find that window, and realize that there's going to be times it's just not going to always work out very well. Here's some alfalfa. This was a study showing 70% alfalfa digestibility for standing hay at 1/10 bloom. When we normally cut it, it dropped about 3% to 67. Rained on hay was 57, so another 10% drop in digestibility. But waiting 3 weeks for the weather to clear, sitting on your hands, it dropped to 52. So that's a significant drop in quality that we want to avoid. So sometimes we need to just take those risks. Now I want to change gears a little bit and get more in the equipment. Let's talk about disc mowers. This is at the cutting stage. There's still a lot of sickle bar mowers around, whether it's in a mower conditioner or a sickle mower. Those sickles, I like them because they do make a fairly clean cut. They don't take high horsepower tractors. You can cut them with use pretty low horsepower to get hay cut. They are going to be slower to get things done. That's probably the biggest disadvantage for them. And then the maintenance that goes along with them is not always fun. But there's a place for a sickle mower still yet. on some farms in Southwest Missouri, or in Missouri, I should say. Disc mowers, though, have pretty much become the industry standard, and that's for good reason. Number one is they are so quick. You can almost go at any speed you can stand to stay on the tractor on, and get a lot done in a hurry. So there's good reason why a disc mower has really become a popular way to do it. Compared that to trying to run a mower conditioner, night and day difference on how much time it takes to get the job done. I do have a problem with disc mowers, though, and that is how close many of them will cut. We tend to cut way lower than we should. And I think we have, in some cases, devastated our stands of grass because of disc mowers cut too close. So if we can raise those up a little bit, put some more skids on them, do anything we can, talk to your dealer. They usually have ways to get them higher. I know it may not cut as nice. It's cut higher, but I do believe that it can have an impact on our stand over time. It does take higher horsepower, and sometimes they can be a little cumbersome to mount, but you can also purchase a caddy to go with those to make it a little easier. I do mention this one. I wanted to throw drum mowers in there. I spent some time in Germany a couple years ago, and pretty much drum mowers seem to be the way that they do it. I think in New Zealand, it's common to use a drum mower. Not really sure why they haven't taken off as well here in the US, but they are, pretty low maintenance. They don't have a lot of parts, very, very limited horsepower needs. You can still cut as quick as you can with a disc mower, I believe. So I think there's a place for these. Sometimes you can add what I don't like about them is you can see the picture up in the upper right. They're not really spreading the windrows out very well for drying. So that's an issue, but in some models, I know you can add a windrower to them, and that can make a difference. So this is one option, particularly for smaller producers. And when it comes to
Tim,
conditioning, yes.
we've got a question.
Oh, okay.
Is there an average cutoff sickle versus disc time and productivity versus each one? I think basically the difference between those two, or
sounds like the question is addressing, how much time it would take to cut, let's say 10 acres or 20 acres of hayfield versus a disc mower. I don't really have a number that I can throw out there. Yes, I still use a mower conditioner, and it just takes takes a lot of time. I don't know if I can give you a number. I'll have to look into that. But I can tell you a disc mower or a drum mower, you're going to be out of there probably, out of a 20-acre field hours before, many hours before. So it's almost night and day in my view. I hope that answers the question some.
I don't have any other questions. So.
Yeah, interrupt me anytime if a question pops up and we need to address it while we're on the subject. No problem.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm gonna keep rolling here. Mechanically conditioning hay. If you're in the legume hay business, you've got a large percentage of the forage that you are harvesting is not grass, but also you've got a lot of clover, lespedeza, alfalfa in the northern Missouri, maybe trefoil. I think you're really going to have to come up with some way to manage the conditioning of that and try to break down that waxy layer and the cuticle of that stem so that it'll dry out a lot faster. The goal is to get stems and leaves to dry out at nearly the same rate, and it can reduce our drying time by 30 to 50%. And these rollers work pretty good. They've been around a long time. Some of them are rubber, some of them are a mix of rubber and steel, some of them are just straight steel. It just on the models. These are a picture out from Dennis Hancock of the University of Georgia, showing an impeller motor. And impellers are quite popular these days. I think they have a place. I will say, though, they are probably best used in thin stem grasses over thick stem and leafy forages. I know one producer that bought 2 of those for alfalfa. He wasn't happy very long with them, and so he went back to the rollers in comparison. But it's still better than having nothing. But still, you might consider what your main forage is when you're buying one of these. I suggest you use wide swaths as much as possible for our dry hay that we're trying to harvest. You can see the picture on the left. That's actually from my hay field and alfalfa. And you can see I try with that mower conditioner to lay it out as wide as I possibly can. The picture on the right, you can see it's more clumped up. That's okay if you're going to be chopping it for silage or you're going to be wrapping it pretty soon. That's fine. But if you're dry baling it, you really would do better to maximize that solar drying capacity by putting it out as wide as you can. And you can reduce your drying time significantly. Tedders, again, I think tedders probably should stay out of an alfalfa or clover field unless we just have to do it. Generally, I think a tedder is probably best used on grass hay, especially maybe the morning after it's been cut, to kind of get it aired out and moving again. Or sometimes we use it to deal with rain on hay and get it drying again. So there's a lot of reasons to use a tedder. I know if you're doing a lot of crabgrass hay, tedders are very important. I think in Bermuda grass as well. So you just don't want it to get too dry before you start using a tedder on it, especially if there's leaf to it. So it can significantly drop drying time. We don't see these very often, but these hay inverters and mergers are sometimes used, especially in high value alfalfa. And they're really nice because they will gently pick up the windrow and turn them upside down off to the side. And so there's a place for them. I've known some alfalfa growers that have had them and they just don't use them much, but there are times when you think, man, I wish I had an inverter right now. So it's not something you'd use all the time probably, but it is an option. I also want to say there is some growing interest, I think, in using preservatives. I see it probably more with the square bale business, but it can be used in your round bale. It basically will speed up the drying time. You can actually start baling at a little wetter condition, and the acids, the buffered acids that are used, will help to dry it down quicker and get the bacteria working to where it'll preserve it better. So I don't have a lot to share with you on that tonight, but I think there's definitely a place for these. These don't rust out balers like they once did. Many of the buffered acids are less corrosive than they used to be. So I just wanted, before I go into the haylage side of it, is there any other questions, Patrick, that have come up, or anybody want to bring something up at this point in time?
I'm trying to kind of get through the question. Basically says, I'm not from Missouri. I'm used to finding a junkyard, so to speak, for tractors and implements. I have had no such luck in Missouri finding places like that. I've been told to find an auction. Issues with that is I do not need the entire implement, just a part. I guess the question is, does Missouri have a junkyard, so to speak, for farm machinery? This
Well,
can wait till the end.
I don't,
presentation.
I don't know. I mean, there are a few out there, but not many, unfortunately. I mean, I know there are there are combine salvages that are out there around the state, but as far as things for, um, implements, I wish there were, but I haven't seen much. So I'm not a very good input on this, but that's
I-
what I know.
Actually, there used to be more, and a lot of them are being cleaned up.
Yeah,
early.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I wish there were more. What else? Anything else
I don't have
coming
anything
in?
else.
Okay. Well, we're right on schedule. I know, wrapping hay and making baleage is not something that everyone does. But I do think that we've got a little bit of an uptick of interest on this. And a lot of it goes to the fact that we live in a very humid state. A lot of the forage that we grow is coming off or needs to come off at the very worst time of the year, believe it or not, in April, in May, early May, sometimes in April. But it's just really hard to get hay put up right in the state of Missouri. It just is. So I call that Missouri's cool season hay dilemma. And so because of that, in order to get hay out of a field in 24 hours versus 4 days, maybe 5, um, the haylage option is appealing to some. So I encourage you to consider this, even though you may not be doing it. Some of you may be, but I think there's a place for it in the state of Missouri. And I think you have to look at your economy of scale. Maybe, Wesley Tucker may get into this a little bit tomorrow, but or the next time. But you have to consider, what your hay volume is to justify some of that equipment, or maybe find some custom operators. I go back to history again, chopping forage, just like chopping corn silage. It's been done. You could put it in a silo. You can put it in a pit. It's been done over the years, particularly on our dairy farms. I throw this picture up here. This was my grandparents' farm in Lafayette County. I took this picture about 1993, and my grandfather and some uncles were milking cows there, and they used that silo that was put up in 1980. And the silo certainly was a game changer when they built that thing. It was a big game changer. I'd say most of the time they put corn silage in it, but it could have had alfalfa put in it just as easily. But I think we've got some, if you've got a silo and it fits what you're doing, continue to use it. But there's some challenges with these silos. I can't tell you how many times I think they had to replace parts and even the entire feeders because they rusted out over time. So there's a lot of wear and tear, a lot of corrosion that comes with these mechanical silos. Today, I think we have some better tools, and a lot of these tools don't cost near as much input as it did. I forgot what they paid for that. It was probably close to $50,000 if I remember. I don't know, but it was at the time that was a lot of money. Yeah, you can spend about that much on forage equipment today, but to get geared up. But a lot of the tools that we use to put up wrapped bales, we already have. They're already there on farm. We just need one more piece of machinery to make this happen. So when we're talking about silage or haylage, I think it's really important to understand there's nothing magical about silage and intake, except the fact that silage or haylage tends to preserve quality. It preserves it. It does a better job of mimicking the standing forage out there better than hay does, dry hay. Does not really enhance forage quality. You're not, you can't put garbage hay into feed into this and expect to get something magically better out of it later. It doesn't work that way. So you got to start early. It gives you a chance to start earlier. That's what I love about this, but it preserves the quality. Um, looking at 54% alfalfa round bale silage or haylage, you can see pre-storage and post-storage. The red dots are pre-storage, the green dots post-storage. There is a slight drop. But then you look at, more drier hay, 22%, you've lost something in the process of that dry down time. In those 1 or 2 or 3 days that it took to get that harvested, we've had more exposure to the weather. Same thing with this red clover round bale silage. You can see haylage or baleage at 21% crude protein versus 16% of hay of the same field, about 5% drop in quality. And really what goes on in a silo is a major change in pH and some bacteria. We start with this acetic acid bacteria during the cell respiration period, the production of CO2. And then as the pH drops, we start getting into the lactic acid bacteria and fermentation actually begins. So the goal of fermentation is to get from that high pH of 6.0 and drop it down to the lower 4s as fast as possible. And the only way that happens is in an anaerobic, no air, no oxygen environment. Traditional haylage, we look at a lot of input costs, a lot of capital investment, a lot of mechanized handling. And so it's less marketable than hay. Sometimes it's harder to sell forage out of a upright silo. There's more maintenance costs. But when if we're chopping forage, there's got this picture from a county agent who does some chopping in Ohio. And he uses a chopper like this to chop forage. And you're basically wilting the forage, from 50 to 60% moisture. You're really going to be chopping it at 3/8 to 1/2 inch lengths, and then ensiling as fast as possible. And there is some advantage to keeping the oxygen out when you're chopping it. It packs pretty good, especially if you can drive over it and pack it down on in a pit silo. So there's some advantage to this, but for most of our producers in Missouri these days, we have a lot of the equipment where we can do some baleage or haylage. And pretty much what I love about it too is that it replaces that capital investment of the hay barn, and we can store our hay outside and keep it protected for at least a year, preferably not longer than a year, or certainly not longer than 2 years if we can avoid it. So you just have much lower initial costs than a conventional silage system. Here's some of the rule of thumbs that we throw out there. Wilt your forage to 45 to 60% and then start baling it. Sometimes we might be on the upper end with grasses, sometimes the lower end with legumes. This is the range that I'm most comfortable with. I know that in legumes, sometimes we've seen it go significantly lower than that successfully. And there is a way to make that happen, but it's a little more risky. But generally, I like to tell you as a general rule of thumb, 45 to 60% moisture is a good place to be. And then wrap as quickly as possible. Don't let it sit around because it'll just absorb more oxygen. And we don't want oxygen in that bale. We don't want it drying out. And some of these balers will crimp the stem before it's wrapped in the chamber. And so that's pretty useful. There's a lot of different wrappers available. So let's get into some of those. This is the platform wrapper. Yes, there's a few used these days. They're not as popular as they probably were a few years back, but good entry level way to get into this. Um, Generally, you're going to have a higher plastic cost, and that's a concern. It does take a lot more plastic than our tubes that we use. Um, some, it's just a lot more labor intensive to do it this way. Stacking these things are a little more challenging, I find, and a lot of times they will poke holes, get holes poked in them. You've got to have the tools to move them around, a grapple. So those are the concerns: labor per bale, the cost, and accommodating these bales. This is a producer in Golden City, Missouri, that uses a platform wrapper for square bales. So you can even use a square bale wrapper out there. The baler wrapper combination has really gotten popular and its interest in some circles. It's a lot more investment involved. It's very convenient. And we'll probably see more of these over time, but a little cost prohibitive for our average producer in many cases. But this is technology that has really has been an advancement. And there's a couple of manufacturers that do this. Again, you want to be sure you're not going to be puncturing those bales, and you want to use a grapple to get those individual bales moved. Let's talk about inline wrappers. Basically it's a sausage stuffer approach. And this is the approach that many of our producers are using. What I like about it is it uses about half of the plastic that the others have used. Generally, we're looking at a plastic that's 4 to 6 mil. We may be spending, I don't know, somewhere around $3.50 for the bale on the left, and each bale on the right, we're probably looking at more like $2. It's probably gone up from that, but I would say that's a fair comparison between the two.
Tim, we got a question.
Sure.
Is the plastic BPA free? Any worry about leakage, seepage of the plastic into the hay? Is that an issue?
I have not heard of that being an issue. I wouldn't be surprised if that's been looked at as much as it's being used today, but no, I have not heard of that being an issue. Any other questions, Patrick?
No, that's all.
Okay. Yeah, I'm getting close to wrapping up here, but we'll say that one thing you want to be careful about is when you're putting these bales together, you want to get them as tight as you can together, and you want to avoid having this major difference from one size of bale to the next. So think about that as you wrap them. And because what happens in that going from one size bale to the next size, you've got a gap, and that's just an air pocket, and we do not want air in there. So any other questions? I think I saw something pop up.
A couple that come up there in the chat. Oops. It says, what is the function and the job of a plastic? That's
okay. The job of the plastic is to be airtight, and so we want it thick enough that it's not going to puncture easily. And by keeping it airtight and taking oxygen out of the equation, and it's wet inside, it's setting it up for that lactic acid to build and ferment. And when it ferments, it's preserving it for as long as, probably a year out or so, in order to keep it, keep the quality there.
then do you have to use a silage baler if you choose to wrap the bales?
Good question. I think yes, you really need a baler that can handle high moisture crops, and so your standard your standard round baler that was probably built 10, 15, 20 years ago probably won't have that ability. Probably depends on the baler. But many of the balers that are produced today will have a silage package on them. And if you're interested in doing this, that's probably the way you'll have to go.
And I think this was just a comment that 6 to 7 layers ran about $3 to $4 last year at 75 cost. Price now is $100 to $115. So it's obviously went up.
Yeah.
Like everything else, everything's
No
went
surprise.
up.
No surprise. I have to say, I haven't looked at this year's prices. So I may be off a little bit, but I mainly wanted to show you some of the relative differences between the two types of wrapping.
And then here's another one. It says, which product's more marketable, net wrap or versus plastic wrap?
Well, as far as net wrap is concerned, I mean, that's probably more marketable. But we're talking apples and oranges here. We really, when it comes to net wrap, where if you're just net wrapping the drier bales, you know, that's a different market than what you'd be selling a wrapped bale for. I mean, yeah, they feed similar, but you got to know what, you know, got to be willing to handle them and all that. So
I think I don't see any more questions. So.
Okay. I feel like I'm going over just a little bit, but I'm about to wrap up here. I've got a few more points I want to make. You know, again, wrap as soon as possible. We don't want it sitting out very long. This is kind of the nuts and bolts of wrapping that I like to promote, and that is wrap at least 4 layers of a 1 mil plastic. 6 layers are ideal. But generally, from talking to folks that have done a lot of this, they'll say that, you know, if you can have your seams about 4 inches apart, you can get that's equivalent to about 6 layers on a 4x5 bale. So, you know, basically we want to shoot for about 4 layers. And this is a picture of a research project in Kentucky that kind of does as good as any job I've seen of showing the effect of bale layers or plastic layers. You can see in this study, it was alfalfa, hay, and silage from the same field a year after harvest, fed to cattle. And you can see the hay on the left side was the last bale they went to. Their consumption was only about 64%. When they had 2 layers there in the middle, their consumption actually dropped to 53%. Not so good. The quality was not preserved as well. Here we go back to that question about plastic and the importance of it. When we put 4 layers in it, it was 84% consumption, so pretty much better. And then 6 layers a year after, 88% consumption. You can see that was almost gone. So it does make a difference, especially if you're going to be keeping this for a long time. The more layers you have, the longer you can keep it. If you're just going to be feeding it in a month or two, a couple layers will probably be fine. But you get a little oxygen seeping into that and the quality will drop and refusal will be an issue. Store them in a well-drained site. We do sometimes have problems with animals, you know, varmints and voles and animals that might give us some problems, some rodents. Storing them on the round ones on a flat side tends to help prevent the squatting. And if you see a hole, patch it with the right material, not just duct tape. Duct tape won't last but weeks. And you've got to have specialized tape in order to keep it tight. I always like to recommend plugging the ends. This is Gene Winslow at Rogersville. And they always do that. And I think that's a good practice. It does take a little extra label to plug those ends with basically a plug bale. And you don't have to do this, but it does do a pretty good job of keeping everything tight. Crops that you can wrap, there's a bunch of them out there, pretty much anything. It's not hard to come up with a forage that you can wrap. Something that's really, really wet may not wrap as well. I've or something too fibrous, but generally, if it's harvested at the right time, it'll wrap okay. Grasses do tend to ferment better than legumes, so a combination of grasses and legumes is a good thing, but you can do either way. You can go either way. Last couple of slides, some tips. Don't use sisal twine because it does break down the plastic quicker. Net wrap is really a better way to go with this. You can use inoculants to speed up the lactic acid formation. Don't ever wrap in the rain. If it starts to rain, stop the wrapping, because that adds oxygen to the system you don't really need. And try to bale them or feed them within a year of wrapping. There are some disadvantages. The baler sometimes may not be suitable for it. There's a lot of weight. That's an issue. The puncturing and the tearing is an issue. And then I think the huge one is the disposal of plastic. We're going to have to figure that one out. We don't have great solutions. We've looked at, tried to attract some companies in here that will bring dumpsters in that we can bring it. But we just haven't been able to attract those companies here yet. But maybe in the future we can, but that's an area we're going to have to address. Patrick, are there any other questions that popped up?
No, I don't think we've had any more questions come up. Are there any questions? I don't hear. Oh, hemp or biodegradable net twine versus plastic twine.
He said hemp or biodegradable
net twine.
Net twine. Okay.
Twine.
Yeah, don't really have an opinion on that. I haven't looked into that very, very closely.
Oh, here's a few others. Do you like unrolling hay or using rings? We'll actually talk about that here in a little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna reserve that for you a little later.
Yeah. There's benefits to both, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
Cost breakdown and marketability of each. I guess, does that have to do with the different twines or the hay? Okay, yes, the different twines.
The cost breakdown of each of those. Again, I haven't gone into it that deep. I'm sorry. I don't know the difference in some of those costs. I do have a in the hay storage. I do have a one chart that we'll get into that later on tonight. We'll look at that. Sisal tends to be much higher than some of the plastic these days, but we'll look at that here in just a little bit.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, here's one. Is there any way to achieve the forage quality of wrapped silage without using plastic and alternative means to achieve the necessary anaerobic conditions for fermentation to occur?
Well, there are, we can, if we have an upright silo, we can use that. We can use a bunker silo or a pit silo. I mean, that's still a viable way to do it. I'll be honest, there's a very large dairy farmer near me, about 3 miles west of me, that, has used a lot of plastic. And I forgot what he told me exactly, but he told me, he said, I spent about 17 or 18,000, if I remember right, on plastic one year. And he said, I'm tired of doing that. And he spent $57,000 on a new bunker silo last year. He's not leaving the plastic, but he is investing more heavily on bunkers. So it's just, he feels like over time it's going to pay off. So it's again, it's economy of scale. It's whatever can justify. Um, it's I've been in this business long enough to know every farm's got a little different set of resources, and the way you do things may vary a little bit, and it's got to fit your method of operation.
Another one here about twines and durability of biodegradable versus nylon plastic twine.
Again, I'm not an expert in that area. I have not studied that very closely. I think the main thing when it comes to these biodegradable materials, I think, it's a matter of how soon you're going to be harvesting or feeding it out. And so, if it's going to be sitting there in the fence row for, 3 years, then we might have some issues. But if you're going to be feeding it all next winter, I don't think it's an issue that I've ever known to use a biodegradable. There may be other opinions on that.
Okay, I think we'll stop it for there. Why don't we take about 5 minutes? And thank you, Tim, and for the presentation, and we'll take about 5 minutes, and then we'll start back up with. I'll do a talk on hay feeding management. Okay, Wesley, can you see the right screen now?
We can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start again. I'm going to spend, hopefully not too long, but I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about hay feeding management. And Tim mentioned a few things I'll probably touch a little on in my talk, and as he goes into the storage talk later tonight, I'll touch on some things that'll actually feed into his talk a little bit later. But one thing I want to talk about as we and Tim, if you could watch and admit people as well, that'd be good. Or Wesley.
Sure, we'll do it.
Thank you. One thing, the other night we had and I wanted to bring this up again. We had a question about early weaning calves, really talking about body condition score, and as those cattle get to a certain body condition score, like they get to a body condition score 4, and we talk about weaning those calves and working with the cow and the calf separately. And I didn't give the right answer when I answered that question. Somebody asked about, well, when's the optimum time, or how old are those, or where do those calves need to be at to wean? When's it all right to go ahead and wean those calves? And I talked about weight, and that's really not the right answer. The right answer is really age. And we talk a lot about in certain times. I know when we had drought talks, we talked about early weaning. And probably the proper answer on that question is if those cows are reaching that 4 body condition score, and those calves are at least 120 days old, or kind of in that 120, 150 day range, that's probably as early as you'd want to wean them. We typically wean somewhere around 180 to 220 days, but probably if those calves are, say, 120 days old, you're probably fine at that point. Now, there's going to have to be some special management with those calves, but you can work with them. Those calves will already should have pretty functional rumen, and so they should be able to graze grass and be fine there. But that's probably about the time if those cows are pretty thin, and those calves are in that 120, 150 day range, and you think you can manage them separately from those cows, that's probably about the time I would think about trying to wean them and trying to start working those cows back up on condition. And so with that said, but hopefully that's definitely a better answer to that question, more about age of the calf versus where I was talking about weight, but really age is the important factor there. So we'll move on and talk about hay feeding management. And it's really an important subject because it's expensive. Hay is expensive. It's expensive, and Tim talked a lot there about baling, harvesting. Equipment's expensive, and there's a lot of equipment involved in hay baling and hay harvest, and that's expensive. There can be a lot of labor involved depending on what you're harvesting, and so that's expensive as well. And we talked about the fact that if we don't do it right, we can waste up to 50% of that hay. So 50% of that hay may not even make it into the cow, and so that's a costly enterprise as well. And we had some more slides about economics related to that and grazing and stuff, and that's probably more Wesley's area, and he can touch on that on next Tuesday night. But basically, feed costs are a very expensive part of a cattle operation. And so as I go through my talk tonight, we're going to talk a lot about how we reduce wastage by feeding hay, or reduce wastage when feeding hay. And that will, if we can be as efficient as possible in reducing those wastages from a feeding hay standpoint. We already talked a little bit about from the harvesting standpoint. Tim will talk about from the storage standpoint. That's how we make our hay more profitable in our operation, is reducing those wastages, and from a feeding standpoint, reducing feed costs, because it costs us to bale it and costs us to feed it. And we can reduce those wastages from a feeding standpoint, which I'll talk about. We can reduce our feed costs, which is a very, as I said, that can run upwards of 60-70% of our cattle operation costs. So, and one thing, I throw this in here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think it was last year, or maybe the year before, we've got a lot of producers that used to feed dry hay, and now they're switching to baleage. And they ask the questions like, well, how much do I feed? And the answer is always the same in the feeding standpoint. We talked about this the other night in nutrition. In the nutrition section, is cows, they have a certain dry matter amount that they consume. And so cows eat pounds of dry matter, not bales of hay. And I'll touch on this a little bit more, but a lot of producers like to talk about how many bales of hay they feed. And if we're going to be efficient in our hay feeding process, we need to think of it more in pounds than bales. And when we talk a lot, and when people are feeding more baleage, we need to talk more about pounds of dry matter, because that's going to vary based on the moisture content. We talked a little bit about that the other night when we were talking about hay tests and stuff like that. So this is just a slide here, and basically our hay feeder designs are going to affect our wastage. And you can see here, both of these feeders don't have a bottom skirt. And so, and there you've got hay all over the place, calves laying on it. And I agree, certain times we need a little bit of bedding. Back in the middle of February, we could probably stand a little bedding for some of those calves and cows and stuff like that when it was very cold and snowy and rough weather. But this time of year, we're feeding hay. We don't need the bedding like that. And so cattle remove it, they step on it, and they use it for bedding. But thing is we all of that's wastage that is costing us money that we don't necessarily need to. And I start with this slide on hay feeding with or without a rack, and this is a very old guide sheet, MU extension guide sheet. This guide sheet 6G4570. I should have sent it to you, but it's a very good guide sheet. We use a lot from a hay wastage standpoint. It talks a lot about it in there about reducing hay wastage and those kind of things. And this here, you can see here, basically with a rack, obviously you get the least amount of wastage there. And we'll talk about unrolling hay here in a little bit. And the thing about it is, with unrolling hay, you want to be at the point where you want to do that daily. You don't want to, like, there, if you put out 7 days worth, you're going to see lots of wastage, and versus a day with those large round bales. Now, if you feed smaller amounts, you're not going to see as much wastage as well. And that's one thing, small squares versus large rounds, when you're not using a hay ring. Now, when you look there with a hay ring, I mean, the wastage really isn't that much different, but you can see there. And that's one thing. If you want to reduce your wastage and not use a rack, one is roll out daily, but also feeding smaller amounts will also help in reducing that wastage as well. This is a very old article or research article where they looked at, and this is at Michigan State University, where they looked at different feeder designs, and you can see that there cones and rings there where the hay, and basically the cone was a little bit better. The ring there, both of those were pretty similar versus the trailer there and cradle. And the thing about it is basically where you're feeding a lot with those trailers and those cradles, there's a lot more space for that hay to be pulled out, pulled on the ground, drug. I mean, with the cradle there, they can go over the top. We'll talk about that here a little bit with the cone, that they can go over the top and pull it out over the top, those kind of things. And so there's a lot more areas for wastage on those, and you see much more wastage with those type of versus the cone and the ring. This is actually some research at Oklahoma State University, where they looked at different types of rings here, an open ring and a poly ring there. Then you've got your just your basic ring there with bottom skirt and then you've also got your modified cone there. And basically from looking at those, you can tell that your open ring or your poly ring where they don't have that skirt on the bottom there, you see a lot of wastage. You see upwards of 20% wastage. That's a lot of wastage on those type of rings there. Then you get over to your cone and your it's basically the ring there with your skirt, your bottom skirt there, and that feeding there, and you notice that the cone does improve. You see about 11%, 11, 12, 13% wastage there with the ring with the bottom skirt there, and then you get to the cone. And basically, what you're doing is by setting that bale up on its end there, you get less of it on the ground, so you get less wastage from that standpoint, and it pulls the and it keeps the hay in that feeding area and doesn't allow it to get out and get on the ground and get stepped on and drug and those kind of things. This is actually some University of Missouri research data here, looking at different types of rings as well, a cone, an open, and then a tapered feeder. And you can see what the types of feeders there on the side. And this is one thing. So you feed higher quality hays, you're not going to see as much wastage. And this alfalfa baleage was very high quality. And if you look there basically wasn't a whole lot of wastage between those, a lot of variation in wastage between those different feeding rings. And so, but then you look at, and the fescue hay was just tall fescue hay, just normal tall fescue hay. And you see there a lot more wastage, not necessarily the cone feeder. Actually, that's similar wastage between the alfalfa and the baleage, alfalfa baleage and the fescue hay. But then you get up there with the tapered feeder and the open feeder, and you see significant difference across each of those as well. And so what this kind of shows is, one, the difference in hay feeders, and also the difference by forage type. And you can see there, the higher quality hays are not going to waste as much versus your lower quality hays. And then when you look at type of feeder there, obviously those feeders without a skirt on them, you're going to see a lot more wastage. And then if you get that bale up off the ground, also with that top ring on there, that helps keep them from pulling it out of the top. You get that bale up off the ground, that moisture doesn't seep into it as much, and that cuts down on your wastage as well versus your tapered feeder there. And so that's kind of some differences there in different types of hay feeders. But that's one thing, that one way that you can really reduce your hay wastage is to bale better quality hay, do it at the right time, right bale packing and all those kind of things, make better quality hay will help some to reduce that wastage in addition to the type of feeder. On a cone feeder standpoint, pros and cons there. It gets the hay up off the ground. I mentioned that because when the hay's on the ground like that, it seeps water and everything seeps into it. And that can cause wastage in addition to pulling it out. But if you get it up off the ground, those cattle pull the hay down into that feeding area, like you see here in this picture. You don't get as much wastage from that standpoint. Also, that top ring there helps keep them from pulling it off the top and wasting it as well. And you see some savings there, about 10 to 20% of hay usage annually, that kind of savings. And obviously saving hay stretches those hay supplies. One of the things, it lasts longer. It's pretty heavily built, hard built feeder, but higher initial cost, of course, versus the others. And if you're going to use a feeder like this, you also have, a lot of people like to put a bale down with a bale with their truck or things like that, lay it on the ground, drop the ring on there. Obviously, you're going to have to feed the hay differently if you move to a cone feeder versus versus your ring feeder that you've normally used. They're not easy to move, and there is, with the chains, there can be, those calves can get into the chains, and it can be a choking hazard. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but based on stuff that I've received, there can be a choking hazard from that standpoint. And here's on this slide, there's an interesting website here that you can go to, Noble Research Institute Hay Ring Waste Calculator. And actually, if you go to this website, you can put in your different types of feeders that you use, how much you're feeding over the year, and it will help you in determining how much wastage cost-wise that you have over the year. And we have some slides on that, but it's basically based on what you do is how much you're actually wasting. And the thing about it is that kind of feeds into, can we afford a cone feeder? Because your cone feeder is going to save you the most hay, but can we afford it? And these are prices from 2014. So like everything else lately, everything's went up in cost. But you can assume about 10% of hay savings on $50 bales. These cone feeders are going to last a lot longer than your typical ring feeders. So 10-year life versus a 1 to 2 year life. So when you look at that savings over that time frame of that bale feeder, if you feed saves $500 every 100 bales fed, $500 every 100 bales fed, over $5,000 for 5,000 bales over 10 years. It's kind of you've kind of got to look at it from your own operation standpoint. Can I afford to go from what I'm doing to a cone feeder? And that's, you just kind of have, and this hay ring waste calculator kind of help you, is a tool that you can utilize, an online tool that you can utilize to kind of identify how much cost you have in hay wastage yearly, and then work from there. I think the next slide, I think we'll move on. Any questions on hay feeders? I guess I'll kind of end by talking kind of personal preference. We look at the savings on the cone feeders versus and I think if probably your typical, I think basically we need to have a feeder that has a bottom skirt on it, because when you looked at the previous slides on wastage, there's a lot of wastage if we don't have that bottom skirt on there. and basically in a natural grazing motion for those cattle. I think starting there and going to that, if you're using a totally open feeder like that, that's you're probably seeing a lot of waste there, and you can really cut down on the waste by going to hay feeder with a bottom skirt on it. I don't know. You just kind of have to pencil it out and see, is it worth the money to go all the way to the cone feeder or not? But I think if you're not feeding using a hay feeder with a bottom skirt on it, then you probably need to be working towards that. I see a lot of hay feeders out there that don't have bottom skirts on them, and probably seeing a lot of wastage in that as well. So, any questions on hay feeders before we move on?
I haven't seen any in the chat, Patrick.
Okay. We'll move on here. Somebody mentioned something about, I believe, unrolling and hay feeders, and there's some advantages to unrolling, and there's also some disadvantages, and really it's the disadvantages are probably due to management, per se. Really, from an unrolling standpoint, you get a better area for those cattle to consume, so you don't have those boss cows pushing those cows away, pushing other cows away, and so everybody gets to eat. You can see there in the pictures, you've got a line of hay there and plenty of room for everybody to eat, versus a hay feeder. Sometimes that can be an issue. Now, the way you get around that is you have plenty of hay feeders out there, plenty of hay feeding space. But and then where you're unrolling it out, you don't have. We'll see some slides later where we've got a hay feeder where you've got a lot of mud around that hay feeder, and that can happen. There's some ways to remedy that problem, but where we're unrolling it out, we don't have as much damage around the hay feeding area because everybody's spread out versus right around a controlled area. You can also, now this gets into, you only want to roll as much as they're going to consume in one day. You don't want to roll out for multiple days. You want to roll out as much as they can consume in one day. And because of unrolling, you can partition that and you can control that. Now, it does help in overseeing your pastures with legumes. Now, a drawback to that, which isn't on the slide, is it can also help in overseeing your pastures with weeds. So that's one thing to keep in mind with your hay. Is we talked about this the other night, is make sure if you're buying your hay, make sure you're buying from reputable people to hopefully keep the weeds out of their hay. But that can be an issue as well. But it does, if it's a legume hay and it's got some seed in there and you roll that out, it helps in overseeing those pastures with legumes as well. And it helps in distributing that fertility back on the field. It's not going to be like if you take it off and you put it back, it's not going to be, and Joe can talk a little bit about that on next Tuesday night, but it's not going to be the same. But by unrolling that hay and back out there, it does distribute that fertility a little bit better. It also distributes that animal fertility a little bit better as well, versus just having a specific hay feeding area. From that standpoint, I don't know how many of you use bale processors, and but one of the myths with those, and I've heard this before, is those bale processors, which basically grind up the forage, will increase forage quality, and that's not true. In some instances, it might actually decrease forage quality. If you're processing that on a windy day and you get some leaf loss, that actually decreases the quality. What it can do, and we'll see a slide here in a little bit, when you decrease, basically what you're doing with a bale processor is you're changing particle size. And when you reduce particle size, what you do is you actually decrease rumen retention time, so it goes through the animal faster, which can increase forage intake. Now, increasing forage intake on poor quality hay is not going to improve that animal's performance. And so you can increase consumption of low quality hay, but it may not be beneficial to the animal, because if it's low quality hay, it's still low quality hay. And so that's, you might get them to consume more of it, but it may not be beneficial to the animal to consume more poor quality hay. One thing it does do from a benefits standpoint is, and a lot of people, what they'll do is if they're making a TMR or something, it allows you to combine forages, different qualities. It allows better combination of those forages for TMR mixing and things like that. It does also allow you, we talked a little bit about nitrates the other night. It does allow you to, if you've got to kind of reduce if you've got a forage that's high in nitrate and you need to manage how you feed that or restrict how you feed that, it helps in that. It does cost money to have these around if you want them. And so ownership costs, increased costs there as well. With anything metal wise like that, it does increase costs. Now, this is a North Dakota study where they looked at different rollout processing cone feeders, tapered cone round bale feeder, which would be similar to some of those feeders that I showed earlier. And you can see there that on 100 cow herd, feed costs per cow, obviously, because you've got more input costs there with the bale processor, and a little bit more input costs with having to unroll the hay probably daily versus with the tapered cone round bale feeder, they're putting out a bale and then they're letting the cattle come to it. So you've got some more costs there, and it did, the unrolling did increase consumption. The bale processing did increase consumption about 10%. But they didn't see any improvement in cattle performance. And that's kind of what we were talking about there just a few slides ago is, yeah, we can increase consumption, but if it's poor quality hay, it's still poor quality hay, and it's not going to help that animal perform any better. Some other things from a feeding standpoint, and this is kind of what I'm getting at here. This looks dry, but it's probably muddy around the bale rings. But basically, keep your feeding areas as dry as possible, because it's not just going to hurt your animal performance as well as your hay quality and things like that. And then this is kind of a way to, that last picture, to kind of keep from having that last picture happen, is to feed on a pattern elevated surface. Basically another way to keep the ground dry around there as well, and saves hay, and it keeps it out of the mud, and it prevents those foot diseases that we tend to have, foot rot and things like that. Make sure they clean it up before you feed more, and that's another thing, is just make sure they clean it up. At certain points, you're going to have to feed more, probably because they've gotten to the point where they don't want to eat it anymore, but just make sure they clean it up. Here's another low labor hay ring management style. A lot of people call this bale grazing, but this is also in that guide sheet, that G4570 MU guide G4570. And basically what you do is you set those bales out on 20-foot centers ahead of the bale feeding season. You use electric fence and hay rings, and you basically just move the fence and move the hay rings as you need more bales. And this also is a good way. We talked about unrolling. It's not quite as good as unrolling from spreading the fertility, but it's better than having just a dedicated hay feeding area and the cattle all come to that area and all eat in that area and keep all the fertility in that area. This does help spread that fertility out a little bit better than just having one hay feeding area, and does cut down on some of that mudding and those kind of issues as well. So it's not like I said, it's not as quite as good as unrolling, because you'll see the fertility spread better with unrolling, but it's better than just having the haste in one area. And then this is a slide in restricting time of hay access in lactating beef cows, and this is something that you might be able to use. It doesn't actually, and part of the issue with this study, this was a University of Missouri study. They didn't see an actual difference in hay wastage percentage. You can see a numerical difference there. Part of the issue was the amount of variation within pen that they had, and that affected their ability to see that hay wastage difference. But I've seen other work where they've looked at that, and there is something to restricting time of hay access. And some other work that I've seen is in dry cows, where they've done that, and they've seen basically they don't see a huge body condition score change between the cows, but they do see a difference in hay consumption, and so those cattle. But in this particular study, you see a difference in hay disappearance by restricting time. Now, the problem is you also see a huge reduction in body condition score change, and in lactating cows, depending on where we're at, and that we talked about that the other night, we may not want to necessarily see that. Now, the body condition score on these cows stayed in a pretty acceptable range, but that's something. And also, if you want to restrict access of hay, I would probably be better to suggest that on dry cows versus lactating cows based on the data that I've seen. Also, I probably would. You also need to make sure it's good quality hay, average or better quality hay, if you're going to do that, because of and have plenty of space for those cattle to consume during that particular time that you are providing that access. But you can see some difference. You can see some reduction in hay, and numerically here they see some reduction in wastage. The one thing I would worry about though is losing too much body condition from that standpoint. Even though they kept milk production was pretty much stayed the same, was pretty consistent, and body condition score didn't fall out of acceptable ranges. But that's one thing I would worry about. But in other data that I've seen on dry cows, about that 8-hour time frame is about where you might look at. Also, younger cows that we really need to worry about body condition. That may not be a good thing to do on younger cows as well. So, kind of wrapping up this section here, but minimizing hay waste at feeding. As I said before, and as we saw in some earlier slides, if you buy good quality hay and you harvest good quality hay and you do it right, you don't see as much wastage. And we saw that if we bale it at the right time and make large dense bales, we don't see as much wastage. Tim will talk about storing properly, but minimize ground contact, and he'll talk about some of that. Keep it covered up. Those kind of things to cut down on wastage. Know what your bales weigh. That gets back to that pounds of dry matter, pounds of hay versus bales of hay. Know what your bales weigh and how much you're feeding and how much you need to feed. And we talked about the need for testing for nutrient quality the other night before feeding. If unrolling, we talked about that, feed daily. And this kind of gets back here, the type of feeder. One, a skirted bottom, obviously, natural grazing position. You can kind of see that there with those tapered bars there on that feeder that's in the picture there. That natural feeding position. Addition of a cone or a taper is probably going to improve your improve your hay reduce your wastage. But you've got to pencil that out. Is that cost effective or not in your operation? And then I would rather move that feeding area around more than have a defined feeding area, but and basically from that standpoint to move around those nutrients. And if you're processing hay, you want to feed it in a bunk or in a inline feeder or something like that, and feeding well-drained areas to reduce those mud, because mud's going to cause health issues on the animal as well as wastage issues on the hay. So, and always have quality should match the animal's needs. And so basically hay quality should match it. So we talked about this the other night, but sorting those cattle into groups based on their stage of production. Your lower quality hay, your dry cows, your dry non-lactating cows, they don't have as high of nutrient need, and so lower quality hay fits well for them versus your your lactating cows or your growing cattle. They need higher quality hay, and so providing from that standpoint. And then when we talk about feeding, and so this is based on the fact that you would more than likely store your better quality hay inside versus outside. And so animals that are fed, you want to feed that lower quality hay first and then feed that higher quality hay, because typically those animals that are fed high quality hay early in the season will often refuse the poor quality hay later in the season. And I guess what it gets at is you feed them the really good stuff, they keep wanting to have the really good stuff. And if you come back with them with some bad stuff, they're going to turn their nose at you. And so that's kind of the thing, is you want to feed that outside hay first before you feed the inside stored hay. The other thing is that outside hay, if you continue to leave that outside, it's going to continue to deteriorate and just get poorer and poorer quality. So we want to feed that quicker versus our inside hay. And like I said, you typically store your poor quality hay outside versus your better quality hay inside. Also with that, outside hay, feeding your better quality hay, I guess I should say it differently. With your outside hay, feeding that poorer quality outside hay first versus your better quality outside hay. And so feeding that coarse, less dense, poorer quality outside hay first before that fine stemmed, better quality, more dense bales, feeding those after your coarse, less dense outside stored hay. So, and then we kind of talked about feeding hay in small amounts, that earlier slide, in a feeder to minimize waste, well-drained areas, remove around, and then just forcing them to clean up. And basically you got to through all of this, you got to think about animal husbandry and watching the animals, the condition of the animals, make sure that they're maintaining and doing well on what you're feeding them. And if they're not, then making adjustments from that standpoint. And then getting to the fact of feeding pounds of hay or pounds of dry matter, not bales of hay. And so this was based on the fact that I had producers contacting me related to they had started feeding baleage and had always fed dry hay in the past, and asking me, well, how much should I feed? And when you look at this, this is and actually our baleage may be a little bit higher moisture than this, but when you look at baleage at 60% moisture, you need to actually feed 46 pounds of hay. So cow consumes 27.8 pounds of dry matter, a lactating 1,200 pound cow, early lactation, 27.8 pounds of dry matter. To reach that, what she needs, you're going to have to feed 46 pounds of that 60% moisture, or 60 baleage at 60% moisture versus, or That should be dry matter, not moisture. But basically that baleage at 60% dry matter, you're going to feed 46 pounds of that versus that dry bale that's typically 90% dry matter. You're only going to need to feed 31. And so that's kind of what we were talking about the other night when we identify how much we actually need to feed. You need to take that into account. And if you're switching from dry hay to baleage, you're actually going to have to feed more to meet those animals' needs. So with that kind of ends the hay feeding section. And so with that, I'll entertain any questions. Is there any questions on that?
Patrick, right now, I don't see any questions in the chat at this point.
Okay.
Put them in there. If you have a question, this is a good time.
Yeah. If you have any questions, I know I kind of probably went through that a little bit quickly, but we kind of talked about some of that the other night, and we'll talk about a little bit more. But any other questions or anything? I think if everybody's fine, I think we'll just Tim, if you're ready to go, I think we'll just kind of move on and try to get us out of here in a pretty decent hour.
Sounds good. And I'll move a little quicker on the next one. But I think there's still some very important things that we need to consider here when it comes to both the feeding part of hay and also the storage. And so I want to hit on some of the highlights of that. So I will take control of the screen here. Okay.
We actually did, Tim, if we want to stop, we could take a, there was actually a question in the chat came in.
Oh,
it may have just came to me that month.
I don't think I saw it.
Yeah, well, says it came a little bit after I think we talked or something, but says I only asked about the biodegradable because I have a small rabbitry, and my customer asked about the plastic and about the plastic twine leaching into the hay, then contaminated hay being fed to the rabbits. They want to know their meat or pet is not being contaminated by plastic. Has anyone else come across the same issue with their customers from the city seeing plastic, then being wary of the purchase? And I'm sorry, I don't deal a lot with that. I just don't deal a lot with that. So I don't really have an answer for that. I don't. And if anybody has an answer, please type that into the chat. Or, but I don't really have an answer for that.
That's not something I've run into as to being a problem, but yet I don't know that it's been researched exceptionally high. But
it's typically we feed a lot of that to, and the one thing about the rumen, it takes care of a lot of problems, and so, but so things that are maybe just touch off that rumen bacteria, it takes care of a lot of those problems. But I haven't heard of any research related to that. And so I don't know of anything.
very good. Well, then I'm going to move on the hay storage.
Okay.
And thank you very much, Patrick. That's great comments you made there on feeding. I think we lose a lot of hay in the feeding process, but I do know that when we're feeding out or storing outside, we potentially can lose a lot there too. I know that hay, as you said earlier, Patrick, hay is very expensive. Whether we're paying 20 bucks a bale or we're paying 60 bucks a bale, it's expensive all the way around. There is a cost in producing it. Just in the nutrient value of it that's stored in that hay, there's some expense. I know that there was hay sold over the winter locally for 40, 50, $60 a bale. I know I've got some other neighbors that had got some $30 a bale hay this winter, but they had to go north of Columbia to get it. And so it's just really, it's expensive, and we need to treat hay like a commodity almost. It's not something that, especially if it has some quality to it, that we want to neglect because the losses really do add up. I mean, this is the basis. This slide right here is kind of the basis of our hay school. It kind of has helped make us realize that we need to be talking about these things. Optimal losses may be, when you look at the big picture, may be up to 30%. But typically maybe 50% or 70% in some cases. So we want to move beyond that. And we've talked about, when it comes to storage, a lot of it starts in the field when we are actually baling hay, and how we treat that hay and what the moisture content is. That's the beginning of it. We've talked about that. We've talked about how we can test our forages. But I want to kind of talk also about how moisture can impact the quality of our forages, of our stored forages. A thermometer can be a good way to monitor it after it is in the bale. If the moisture is high, as you can see in the red line here, up at 35% moisture, what we generally find is that the temperature will escalate significantly. And it could escalate to the point that we start developing bacteria that will lead to combustion internally. And so that's what we definitely want to avoid. There's been a lot of barns that have burned over the years because of this. Unfortunately, it doesn't fix itself very quickly. You can see from this chart, this is University of Missouri data that was generated many years ago, but it's still applicable today, that within 4 or 5 days of the harvest of hay, the temperature may have gone from an ambient temperature of 75 degrees to pushing 150 degrees or more. And it does not drop very quickly. It just doesn't drop very quickly. It takes a while. And so, and in some cases, it can continue to escalate in an extreme situation, and then fire is going to happen. So we want to keep it below that red line of 120 as best we can. And the best way to do that is with that keeping the moisture right at the very beginning when we bale. So, having a thermometer that can be probed into a bale can be a very useful tool. And even a compost type thermometer doesn't really cost that much. Many of the extension offices in Southwest Missouri have thermometers available that can be used to determine moisture or temperature of the bale. And in some ways, after it's baled, I think a thermometer can really be a useful tool in monitoring a situation that you're concerned about. Generally, if it's under 120 degrees Fahrenheit, it is safe, but it gets in that danger zone above that, and it could either go up and slowly drop over the course of many, many weeks, or it can, in the right circumstances, continue to go on up. And if we get above 160, fire is pretty much likely. And so you got to be really careful once you start getting up there. So use a thermometer to monitor that. Now, kind of the crux of what I want to talk about tonight, though, is how we store our bales, particularly when we're storing them outside. There's this idea that, well, if we can put it under a tree line, we've got some shade under there, there's not going to be as much exposure to the atmosphere. That is totally false. In fact, under a tree line, it does not dry out. You'll have a lot of dripping of moisture under there, and it'll actually stay wetter longer in the day, and you're actually creating a situation where it is, deteriorating much more rapidly. And I actually took this picture along a county road, and it's just a situation where it's almost the worst way to store hay that I can think of. Under a tree line, rammed together like this on all sides, at the bottom of the hill next to a ditch. Water comes rolling off that hill right through that area. And it's just, when you're thinking about how much money we've got invested in hay, I think we should do better. And so that's what we're going to focus on here. And this slide, to me, kind of sums it up best of all. For outside storage around bales, we tend to have more dense or less dense hay is typically going to squat more. And when it squats, there's more square inches of forage touching the ground and coming in contact with moisture. Where we have the greatest loss is on the ground level. It's not on top so much. It can be. And if we don't store it properly, it can be significant up on top and on the sides. But our biggest issue is generally on the ground. So having a tight bale that is held together well with wrap is probably a much better way to go. Again, we talked about under trees, how it doesn't dry out. The ground that we put it on, water needs to be running away from that ground. We do not want sides to be touching because we're going to end up with moisture retained on the sides, with the exception of the flat ends. I think that if we can butt them together fairly tight, that can make a difference. But when the rounded sides look like two roofs that are hitting each other and nothing to hold it in the middle, with nothing, there's no gutter in the middle to move that water away. It's just going to absorb on into the bale. And then, of course, the smaller the diameter, which we've moved away from the 5x6s in many cases, and we're doing more 4x5s. As we go to a smaller diameter, this whole situation becomes more and more important. How we handle our bales and where we store them and how much water is flowing underneath them, that sort of thing is important. So it doesn't take very long. I mean, obviously this hay's been there more than a year, but it doesn't take very long sometimes for some major losses to occur. And we just can't afford that in our industry anymore. We just can't afford that. It's just too expensive. If you think about how moisture affects a bale, the pattern is actually there on the left. You can kind of see what it typically will do. Moisture will wick up into the bale. You'll have some on top sometimes and maybe some on sides. But the biggest loss is going to happen at the base, especially if it's been sitting there for, 10, 12 months or more. You're going to have the greatest loss. And that's equivalent to about 6 inches all the way around. If you really kind of did the math, it's about 6 inches all the way around. And my question is, how much loss is occurred if we have this much equivalent of 6 inches layer around a 5x5 round bale? How much loss does that amount to? Well, the answer is 36%. Well over a third of the hay is gone. And so that's, I realize that's maybe a little bit of an extreme case there, but a third of the hay is gone. That's not going to be affected. So, you stack that on top of the losses at harvest. You tack that on the losses during the feeding process. It may be 70% gone and only 30% left by the time it's really, when you really think about how much loss occurs in the hay process. So here's another chart, kind of the same thing, looking at that 36% on a 5x5 bale at 6 inches. You know, it doesn't take long with a smaller diameter bale for those numbers to really mount up. And the deeper we go into that bale, it can be quite significant. Here's just another way to look at it, kind of the same type of thing. But again, we're looking at bale shape that really affects how much weathering occurs. You can see, you know, the moisture penetration on this one was 16.3 inches versus the other one at 3.5 that had a tighter shape. You know, it melted away and went down. It was only 74% of its original height, and it was also very difficult to handle at that point. So having a good type bale is important, and then taking care of the base of that. Number one is making sure water is shedding away, that it's not creating a pond bank for water to collect underneath it. So at the top of a hill, it's really in open sunshine is probably one of the better places to put it. At the crest of the hill, if you have one. I mean, unless you're up on a prairie somewhere, we have a lot of hills in my part of the world. And so putting them out there where water's going to run away is going to make a difference. But also you can use other ways of getting it up off the ground: pallets, poles, railroad ties, or just crushed rock, you know, some coarse rock for them to sit on can make a big difference as well. It can get labor intensive if you're not careful. I think placement is going to be the most important thing, along with having a good round tight bale that has less impact or less exposure to the ground. So getting on that note, I will talk a little bit about the advantages of net wrap. It typically will shed about 2 times as much than twine. So there's some advantages on the top end that way. We can move a lot quicker through the hayfield when we're baling, saving fuel and labor. So you're not having to stop as long and rotate that bale in the bale chamber to wrap it as much. So that's an advantage. But I think a huge advantage is just holding its bale shape longer. And if we're moving it a lot, that helps to kind of keep the shape in better shape. And then sometimes we can save time at feeding. I will say though, I've talked to a producer just this last week from Newton County that said, I'm just going to get away from it. It takes too long for him. He stores all his hay in the barn, so it's outside is not as big of an issue. So he's actually going back to a plastic twine baler. And so it like I say, it just depends upon what your needs are. I think majority of the needs across the state of Missouri, you know, the net wrap fits very well. Here is some more proof that shows that alfalfa grass round bales stored on the ground. This is actual data showing the moisture content on twine wrap versus net wrap, and big difference here. You can see that you know, the dark red stayed drier and protected a lot longer with net wrap. Just a tighter bale altogether. Twine wrap, you still had some moisture penetration in that bale, and definitely at the bottom. The economics, I haven't priced net wrap just lately. I'm sure it has jumped like everything else, but generally we find that it has been running about 30 to 50 cents more per bale than plastic twine. These are some prices that you know, you might run across at the farm store. This is another way of looking at it. Just looking at that 4x5 bale size, you can see the plastic twine is the pink, running to what's that, about 60, 65 cents a bale. Net wrap was another 30 cents more, 40 cents probably. And then in this case, sisal twine was the highest. It's actually gone up in price over the years, seems like. Another thing about outside uncovered storage is keeping that space between it. And I'm not saying, 3 inches. I'm talking about 3 feet. The main reason for this is to get more sunlight exposure. And so getting that sunlight exposure will help to dry it out quicker. But if we're 5, 6, 1 feet apart, we may not get as much of that exposure, and it'll stay wetter longer. So we figure that about having about 3 feet apart is a good way to go. I think a common mistake is to put them pretty close. And also one thing that tends to help is, and this isn't something you just have to do, but, having that north-south direction might help with sunlight exposure as well to dry it out quicker. So you'll get more of that good exposure all the way across the sky. Couple things. Pyramid stacking is one approach. We've got a handful of people that have done this instead of buying a barn. This is certainly a viable way to do it. If you're willing to put a little work in on the front end to get that stack built, that can be done. It does take a little labor and more than 1 or 2 people probably to get the job done, and a still day to get these tarps on. And then you got to make sure that these tarps are, buckled down enough that they're not going to be flying away. So it does take a little preparation, but so does a barn, to get a barn built. So, stacking them in this configuration can be a good option.
Generally, we got a question.
Yeah.
It was back 2 slides ago, I think. Question about last slide about the moisture. Actually, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, it says, is that the amount of moisture in the bale? Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah. This slide here is addressing the actual amount of moisture. This was a research project that was done, I think, in Linneus, Missouri, many years ago. This might have even been back in the 70s or 80s, but it did a nice job of showing how much percent moisture you actually had in the bale at any given point of the bale in 2 different scenarios. Actually, this probably was not in the 70s with net wrap. I think this was when net wrap first came on the scene when they did this study. Any other questions?
No, that's all, I believe.
Great. Well, I also like the idea of having that 4 to 8 inches of 2 to 4 inch crushed rock, just to get it up and elevate it a little bit, and then making sure that it slopes away from the stack. I think that's so important. Placement of where we put these things. Sometimes we don't always get a great choice, but we do the best we can. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on structures. Our engineer, who's since retired, Bob Schulteis, put a lot of this together and did a really nice job of sharing it. But I just wanted to, and you've got this in your handout that Patrick sent you just before the meeting. And so you can go through some of this information, but I will summarize that, wood truss barns have definitely have a place, especially for the smaller structures. If you had a fire and you can get it out, I mean, it's still usable. You can repair them. If you have storm damage, it's easier to repair. But there's some limitations, especially when we're talking about, we don't have the rafter space that we can put bales up in. So that's an issue. But a steel truss barn, generally you have a little more space up in the rafter area that you can stack hay a little bit higher if you've got the equipment to get it up there. Generally, it's more economical than a wood barn if it's over 40 feet wide. and the construction is much faster. That picture I showed you that had my barn in it, that's a 30 by 60 by 14 tall. And I'll have to say the folks that built that thing really surprised me when they had it built in 7 hours. 7 hours to build that thing, and it was a steel structure barn, not counting the overhead doors on the ends. So it goes up pretty quick and pretty solid. And so um, one issue is that if you do have a fire in it, yeah, it may not burn as quick as a wood barn would, but if you get a lot of heat in that barn, that steel strength will suffer, and you probably have to start all over. The metal hoop roof barns have certainly a place with hay bales. They generally are less costly than wood or steel. They usually come in a kit, a Quonset type kit. Sometimes they're galvanized. Sometimes you might use a polyethylene roof cover that will last about 10 years generally. We do see a few of those around. Stacking height's not an issue, except you do have some issues on the lower sides where you might not be able to stack quite as much, but they are fairly conducive for round bale storage. I have seen a few that have been damaged easily by getting a little too high, getting that loader up in some of that and damaging the roof. So you got to be careful about that. When you're sizing hay barns, I'll tell you this, Bob Schulteis did some of the math and found that generally 310 cubic foot per ton on large round bales is a good place to start. And with small squares, which you can put a lot more density in there, 250 cubic foot per ton. Inside storage of square bales, you can see, they put about 160. In this example, this is going to be a 40 by 60 by 16 barn. Okay. So they were able to put on edge 164 tons in that barn, as you can see here. That's on edge. If you did twine side up, they lost about a ton, not a lot. So there's not a big difference between how you stack them. Everybody's got a different opinion on that. On the large round bales in the same barn, they were more in this configuration, being just 3 rows high. They were putting about 93 tons or 252 bales in it. If they went on up into the rafters, they could put 307 bales in that barn, 113 tons. So compare that to 164 tons of square bales. I mean, you're not putting as much in the barn, but you're still making a big difference. You certainly want to leave the bale off on the sides. It's tempting to want to put a bale up there, but if you put that kind of weight up against a 16-foot side panel, it's probably leading to failure over time. So it's not a good idea to put that kind of weight up there that high. This is probably the most effective way to stack in a barn that size, where you're putting it on end. Some people like to do this, some people don't, but generally you're putting 288 bales, whereas you were putting 307, I guess, or 252, depending on what you're after. It's a fairly efficient way to get hay stored on end if you're willing to go that route. So just to wrap up here, here's a couple of barns I took pictures of a while back on farm visits. You can see this producer on the left in Taney County was putting bales up on end, and pretty efficient in how he was doing it in this wood structure. And over here in Greene County on the right, you can see some damage up there on the roof, by the way. But he was able to get quite a bit of hay in that way as well. So these are just some things I wanted to kind of touch on as we kind of wrap up tonight. Are there other questions, Patrick, that we can address?
I do not see any more questions. Anybody have any questions for Tim or myself for tonight? I do not seeing anything. I think I think we'll call it an evening. Thank you all for being on tonight. I'll before our next meeting on Tuesday, I'll get the handouts out to you. I'll also, like I said, I'll have the video. Hopefully I'll get it done tomorrow. If not, I'll definitely get it done by Monday, and provide that and pass that along to you, the people who have registered. As far as next Tuesday, that'll be our final evening of the hay school, and we'll be talking about hay fertility and pest management. Joel Scheit, who was on Tuesday night, will be talking about that. And then Wesley Tucker will be talking about economics of hay production and COVID-19 considerations. So with that, again, thank you, Tim, for being on tonight and providing those presentations that you provided. And again, thank you everybody for being on. And of course, if you have any questions or anything, we've got our contact information. Please send us an email or give us a phone call, and be more than happy to try to answer those questions for you. So thank you again, and see you Tuesday.